Namaskar and welcome to this very special episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. As we celebrate Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, 75 years of our independence, we do so with the world. Therefore, as part of the commemoration of India's 7.5-decade journey as an independent nation, we at Diplomatic Dispatch decided to look at the evolution of independent India's foreign policy. What we achieved during the last 75 years, what were the challenges we faced, and what are the lessons that we learned. We have structured this Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav special in two parts. In part one, we will trace India's external relations from 1947 to 2014. And in part two, we will focus on India's foreign policy since 2014 and the new direction and momentum that the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi has provided it. 75 years is but a small speck in our long civilizational history. Yet, it witnessed many milestones, some uplifting, some somber, but all reflecting the theme of continuity and change in India's foreign policy. In today's special episode, we will look at the foreign policy choices that independent India made in the 7 decades till 2014 and how they shaped our country and the world. To decode India's diplomatic strategy during these 7 decades, I am privileged to have an outstanding panel with me in the studio. Ambassador TCA Raghavan is a former diplomat who served as India's High Commissioner to Singapore and Pakistan and as Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs. A history enthusiast, he is the author of 3 well-reviewed books. Professor Amitabh Mattoo was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Jammu from 2002 till 2008 and is currently Professor of Disarmament Studies at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies at JNU. He has published 10 books on nuclear issues, foreign policy and international relations. Ms. Suhasini Haidar is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, who writes regularly on India's foreign policy and international relations. A very warm welcome to all of you. Now, as you all know, foreign policy takes time to build and take shape. Even a decade may not be enough to see the whole picture. So for purposes of our discussion, we have adopted a conceptual framework which looks at the evolution of Indian foreign policy through 3 broad periods, each a response to a different strategic environment: 1947 to 1971, 1971 to 1991, and 1991 to 2014. So let us begin with the first period, 1947 till 1971. Suhasini, what were the foreign policy priorities of a newly independent India in its first 2 decades?
You know, it's interesting that you have divided up India's foreign policy history in these brackets, because I like to look at it as a kind of progression from 1947 and an age of idealism to the second period you referred to as an age more of realism, followed by an era of pragmatism, and to the present, which is much more realpolitik, looking at dynamic changes in foreign policy. In 1947, there were many parts of the environment that the government, headed by Pandit Nehru, was really looking at. There was an idealism born of having won over the British. There was an idealism born of having ended the Second World War and the concept of the United Nations coming to the fore. The idea that colonialism, that racism, these things were going away was a big thing. And actually, if you were to just go back in time to, I think, September 1946, when then the Constituent Assembly had met and Pandit Nehru addressed them, he spoke about the foreign policy of an independent India. He went on to All India Radio after that, actually, and spoke about this as well. And over there, he spelled out an 8-point kind of foreign policy doctrine, which included things like world peace. India would work towards world peace. India would work towards non-alignment. It was actually spoken about long before non-alignment came around. There was, of course, the Asian conference, the Afro-Asian conference that followed. But this in 1946 is where we see them speak about non-alignment. They spoke about anti-colonialism, anti-racism. There was also a doctrine in there for the rights of the Indian diaspora, no matter where they may be. So what we're seeing a little bit of today in terms of the diaspora was also a big, a point for them then. And finally, he spoke about the concept of one world, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So this is all in those first era of Indian foreign policies doctrines that were set out then.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, One of the first big international issues that the government of India had to deal with was the incursion by Pakistani tribesmen and troops into Jammu and Kashmir, and the occupation by Pakistan of a portion of Kashmir, which is still under its illegal control. Prime Minister Nehru took the Kashmir issue to the United Nations, and 75 years later, it still remains on the agenda of the UN. Could it have been handled differently?
Well, many people have felt over the years that taking the Jammu and Kashmir issue to the UN was an error of judgment for which the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru is held responsible. And it is felt that this was an error of judgment because of the sense of idealism. It was felt that the United Nations would be a neutral and impartial and perhaps a correct observer and decision maker to this issue. So it was an error of judgment because it was felt that the United Nations would see what was happening in Jammu and Kashmir in terms of the way we saw it, rather than in terms of differing interests, and actually things did not play out that way. And perhaps there is some truth in this view. But one should also remember that this sense of idealism was throughout tempered by realism and also a certain amount of realpolitik, because Jawaharlal Nehru, more than anyone else, saw that there was a geopolitical game afoot, and the United Kingdom or the Britain at that time, which was more important than any other power because it was the former colonial power, was at the heart of this geopolitical game, and he felt that that geopolitical game should be thwarted. He also felt that just because Jammu and Kashmir had a Muslim majority, it did not automatically mean it should be part of Pakistan. And since the political class at that time of Jammu and Kashmir, led by Sheikh Abdullah, identified to a great extent with the ideals prevalent in India, therefore he felt that that should be given a chance. So while it is true that perhaps Nehru committed an error of judgment in taking the matter to the UN, but it is also a fact that possibly Jammu and Kashmir would not have been part of India but for the initiatives which Jawaharlal Nehru took at that time for both geopolitical as also reasons of solidarity with the composite and syncretic culture of the state.
Now, Professor Mattoo, as Suhasini said, the early decade of independence was also a period when Nehru sought to identify India's foreign policy with anti-colonialism, anti-racism. India was the first country to sever trade relations with apartheid South Africa, and then subsequently imposed a complete diplomatic, commercial, cultural and sports embargo on it. India also tried to steer clear of the Cold War bipolar world by following a non-aligned foreign policy. Was it the right strategy for its time?
Mr. Swarup, I think that when Nehru and his protege, Krishna Menon, actually articulated the policy of non-alignment, it's often, we have a tendency to see it as a reflection of only idealism. I'd say that there was a matching of both values and interests, both idealism and realism. It was the only real pragmatic choice open to a weak country which had been recently decolonized. Because if you get, and Nehru thought this wisely, if you get involved, embattled in the superpower rivalry, one, you will not be able to focus on the challenges within. You will not be able to punch over your weight, which you can do if you have the moral authority to do so. In other words, you cannot exercise the influence that you would have wanted to in international relations, because Nehru was an internationalist. So in some ways, non-alignment today, we often look at it as a reflection of idealism. I'd say that was a realpolitik answer to the challenges that India faced. Now, if you consider many of the initiatives that Nehru took, and you listed out some of them, but even the Korean War, the United Nations asked Nehru to mediate at a point when India didn't have the military capacity, India didn't have the economic capacity, but it only had the moral voice to be able to speak up.
It's interesting you mentioned the word realpolitik, because one of the milestones during this period was the liberation of Goa from Portuguese rule. But it happened only in 1961, even though we had achieved independence in 1947. Why did it take so long?
I think, first of all, as I said, Nehru's own worldview was a blend of realism and also faith in values and ideas. Of course, the Sardar was much more driven as his home minister by realism, but unfortunately he died early. But that policy on Goa is a reflection of both these strands. For a long time, Nehru had hoped, and indeed India had hoped, that the Portuguese would realize that by themselves the complete absurdity of having an enclave within India, which was, they claimed was a part of the metropolis and wasn't really part of India. But there was no give. And there was a struggle by the Goan people within Goa against Portuguese rule. So only when things came to a head did Nehru finally allow the military to intervene and liberate Goa. Remember that, however, that while the Soviet Union abstained in the Security Council, the United States, including Jack Kennedy, even while they didn't censor India, spoke and said, oh, you were the ones who keep on morally preaching us, and now look at what you have done. But the fact was that for Nehru, national interest came first, as is the case with all prime ministers of India, but he blended the idea of having faith in values along with a strong sense of realism.
Now, Suhasini, an even bigger milestone was the Chinese invasion of 1962. It was a shock to Nehru, almost shaking his idealistic foundation to the core. What led to this debacle?
Well, I think if you look through the 1950s, the seeds of what happened in 1962 were in a sense being sown because there was such a huge push towards India-China relations that perhaps we moved too quickly. And, you know, at present, there are so many books that are out that talk about the idea that India didn't completely understand China. Even today, as we talk about the India-China standoff at the line of actual control, there's a kind of sense of we don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And I'm sure that was some of what was the reason that we saw it. There was a lack of preparation, clearly. There was a certain amount of denial of how far the Chinese would go. But I think if you very quickly look, and it's so difficult to encapsulate what happened in just that decade, in the 1950s, there were a time of talks. There was the Panchsheel. India actually gave up some of its enclaves inside Tibet at the time. Zhou Enlai made 3 visits to India. The first one was very interesting because he was actually flown on an Indian plane from Geneva. And, you know, treated very well. That was a very good visit. The last visit was a very acrimonious visit. In between, the Dalai Lama had actually come to India. In fact, there's that very interesting photograph of Prime Minister Nehru, Zhou Enlai and the Dalai Lama all on one stage at one particular time. They even had a meeting, I think, in Rashtrapati Bhavan and things. But clearly the Dalai Lama coming to India in 1959 was a huge inflection point, if you like. Again, something perhaps that was not studied as well as perhaps it should have been. And, you know, as you just mentioned that in a sense, Prime Minister Nehru was shocked. I think it was a quote of his that actually showed us how he felt about 1962 and why I made the point that there was a lot of idealism before in the first phase where he said we were out of touch with reality of the modern world. We were living in an artificial world of our own creation and now we have been shocked out of it. He said this in October 1962, right at the beginning of the wars. And I think if you see what happened in the 1950s, of course, there were a lot of positive things as well. There was the non-alignment movement that came and of course, China was a big part of it to begin with. But clearly the differences between their understanding of how they were going to proceed just kept growing and growing. And then the shocker was really the Chinese betrayal, what happened during the war, the problems that our troops faced at that time. And Nehru and, of course, Mr. Krishna Menon and others looking like abject failures. I mean, Prime Minister Nehru died maybe a year and a half after that.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, there was another war, this time with Pakistan in 1965, which ended with the Tashkent Declaration. How did that impact our foreign policy?
Well, the 1965 war in India was seen as a war which had been imposed on us, that it was initiated by Pakistan.
Operation Gibraltar.
Operation Gibraltar, Operation Grand Slam, and so on. But it was a war which we did not want. Our economy was going south. We had numerous domestic difficulties at the time. So it was, in brief, a war which Pakistan imposed on us. And I think as a consequence of it, opinion in India hardened with regard to Pakistan quite considerably. And the consequences of that are played out through the rest of the 1960s and culminate finally in 1971 with the breakup of Pakistan. And many of the factors which we see on the surface in 1971, in fact, the roots of that were germinated in the 1965 conflict. And certainly in East Pakistan itself, there was this sense that West Pakistan has abandoned us in 1965, because the view then in Pakistan was that the defense of the East lies in the West. And certainly many in India saw this as the thin end of a wedge which we could use to our advantage. So I would say in sum, as far as Pakistan was concerned, views in India hardened very considerably. But as a downside, certainly the 1965 war following on the 1962 war had a very bad impact on our economy, because of which our international standing certainly floundered a great deal through the 1960s. We were going through a major food crisis, and it led to innumerable domestic complications and difficulties.
Now, Suhasini, on the positive side, the late 50s and early 60s was when both our atomic energy and space programs first began with foreign collaborations, but aimed at building autonomous capabilities within India. We also began international collaborations for education and industry, setting up IITs and steel plants with foreign partners like the US, Britain, Soviet Union and West Germany. How significant were these early partnerships?
If you look at this particular project, in a sense, at the inauguration of the Bhakra Nangal, I think Prime Minister Nehru said these will be the temples of modern India. And he didn't just talk about dams. He was talking about these educational institutions. He was talking about the setting up of these big steel plants. And he was setting a vision for India that would be, in a way, self-reliant. Now, I think there is some truth to the idea that had India not been so socialist, we could have opened up much earlier. But I would say when you travel in the neighborhood of India, you can see the difference that these years of a foundation of building our own structures, building our own educational institutions that were world class. Eventually, you know, people came out of these institutions and have been, you know, taken up in every part of the world. Today, they're the most successful people there. The fact is that the foundations were very much laid at that time. And I don't think even the economic reforms that we saw in 1991 and post-91 would have been possible had you not had this base of construction, of manufacturing, of building our own education.
How important were international collaborations for the Green Revolution?
I think international collaborations were fundamental and extremely important, but ultimately I think there was this drive and energy of Indian scientists who, of course, consulted with people like Norman Borlaug and others, but people like M.S. Swaminathan, for instance, who really grabbed this opportunity. Remember, PL 480 was in some ways a blessing in disguise. You could import agriculture surplus from the United States, and then in a rupee dollar fashion, and then rupees here would be spent on primarily fostering cooperation in many areas. But the Johnson administration, I think in the last days of the Kennedy administration and Johnson administration, sanctioned India to a ship-to-mouth policy because of our view on the Vietnam War. That led to this new drive of energy that even though we are dependent, let's try and make a difference. And you saw Punjab particularly, the eastern Punjab really was not the fertile part of the Punjab. The canal system existed in western Punjab, which had gone to Pakistan. But primarily because of that drive, and also because of the agriculture research institutes and the universities had been set up at that stage as well, in collaboration with the West, in the United States particularly, you created this pool of scientists who wanted India to become self-sufficient. And really, that mark of confidence in foreign policy, that mark of confidence on us as people came, one of the important markers was self-sufficiency.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, the 1950s was also when India first began its participation in UN peacekeeping operations, starting with the Korean War and then the Suez Crisis. Why was the UN and UN peacekeeping important to India?
Well, UN peacekeeping was important to India because it was also a way of reaching out to large parts of the decolonized world. And because decolonization was often accompanied by conflict and civil wars, and of course also external aggression, India felt that its contributing troops to maintain peace would be part of its larger political package and a political outreach to these countries, as also establishing its role as a major player in the UN. So certainly the Korean War, but before that the Suez crisis. But while we did substantially increase our contribution in terms of peacekeeping forces, and we remain the largest. Contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, I think the overall political impetus of India having an independent position should also be kept in mind. In Suez, we took a very clear position that this was an act by former colonial powers, France and Britain, against Egypt, which was now a sovereign country. But there was a great deal of criticism in India at that time because of the position we took on Hungary. When the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, we did not condemn it in the same forthright terms.
So with that, we conclude our first part, and we now turn to the second phase, 1971 to 1991. Suhasini, how would you describe this phase of India's foreign relations?
Well, as I said, I think you see the shift immediately. Would Prime Minister Nehru, Prime Minister Shastri have thought about the Bangladesh Liberation War, the way Prime Minister Indira Gandhi executed it? It's hard to go back in time and decide, but I don't think so. And it shows that there was now a very different kind of harder, if you like, foreign policy coming about. We also see in 1971 a sense of this realism coming through in the diplomacy prior to the Bangladesh Liberation War. The entire year and a half before the actual war took place, we see how India reached out diplomatically. And it explains also, because if you remember in March 1971, the Pakistani army had carried out Operation Searchlight. And these atrocities that happened in Bangladesh, in a sense, had really focused the world's attention and India's attention in particular already by March. There was a lot of commotion inside Parliament asking why Prime Minister Gandhi was not going in, was not taking a tougher stand when it came to Pakistan. And the answer only seems to be, and this is all in hindsight really, seems to be that there was the realism that India could not do this completely alone and taking on the whole world. It was very clear that the United States was not going to stand with India. And it took those months to set up for the Soviet treaty, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, I think in August that year. And then the subsequent reach outs to countries around the world where special envoys were sent everywhere, including to the United States. That one, of course, didn't do so well. But we did see New Delhi making that effort because of that sense of realism. This was no longer a perfect world where people would come necessarily to Bangladesh's help, but India did that.
Now, following on from what Suhasini said, Professor Mattoo, one of our biggest foreign policy successes was indeed the end of East Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, following the surrender of the Pakistani army at Dhaka. So what were the circumstances that led to it, and how was it achieved?
I think that was, as you rightly pointed out, one of the most brilliant successes of India's foreign policy since 47. And it was a combination of using force and diplomacy in exactly the optimal level that you needed it. And to achieve this success, of course, you have to go back into history. Pakistan was created as a geographical monstrosity. Yes. You had the huge landmass of India separating East and West Pakistan. In fact, Jinnah had said, this is not the moth-eaten Pakistan that I wanted. Having said that, but there was clearly discriminatory policies followed by the Punjabis primarily, but also West Pakistan more generally against the Bengalis. Suhasini talked about Operation Searchlight, where there were such tremendous atrocities. The election of Mujibur Rahman in 1970 was annulled. So you had created, Pakistan had created a situation in East Pakistan which was boiling. You had atrocities, you had 10 million refugees moving into India. And the Bengali was feeling completely marginalized. But then I think India realized that here was an opportunity, but you needed to do what Suhasini pointed out. First, take the world with you, knowing, however, that the Americans were not going to be with you, also because Pakistan was acting like a conduit to improving relations with China at that stage. So, despite that, obviously the Soviet Union was an ally. You got public opinion on your side. Then you use your intelligence service to help bolster the Mukti Bahani. And finally, you had, of course, Sam Manekshaw. And I mean, obviously, his role often people think has been exaggerated, but he was a great leader. And so Mrs. Gandhi, Sam Manekshaw, and let me add, which Ambassador Raghavan offered, refers to the Panch Kashmiri Pyaras, the 5 advisors of Mrs. Gandhi, which is D.P. Dhar, T.N. Kaul, P.N. Haksa, P.N. Dhar, and Ramji Kao. Those 5 advisors, together with the intelligence system, together with the diplomatic system, were able to achieve this absolutely spectacular victory. In fact, this, along with the nuclear tests and other achievements of the present government, would count as the great markers of India's foreign policy success.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, following the India-Pakistan War of 1971, Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto signed the Simla Agreement on the 2nd of July 1972. Now, there are some who say this was the right agreement for its time and others who criticize it. How do you evaluate it?
Well, to many, the Simla Agreement was the anticlimax after the victory of December 1971. And in that view, the gains of the battlefield were lost on the negotiating table. Many felt at that time that the Panch Pyaras, which Dr. Mattoo referred to, had committed a serious error of judgment, because this was the time to have pinned Pakistan down and resolved Jammu and Kashmir once and for all, instead of having an agreement which was made only marginal gains. And
talked about the final settlement.
Left the final settlement for later. The marginal gain was, of course, that it was now a matter to be resolved bilaterally. So this they feel was an error of judgment. In my view, this is not a realistic assessment, because this was the most that you could have got at the time. One should remember that 1971 was not a war over Kashmir. It was the only war between India and Pakistan which was not Kashmir-centric. Your victory was in East Pakistan or in Bangladesh. It was not a victory over West Pakistan. So you had got what you could in terms of that negotiation, but that view has persisted. And to my mind, this is for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's a view in India that no matter what agreement you reach with Pakistan, it's a waste of time. So there's been criticism of the Indus Waters Treaty, there was criticism of the Tashkent Agreement, there's criticism of Simla and of subsequent initiatives. So there is this view that there is no point working with Pakistan. The second reason is a more significant one, that as our frustrations in Jammu and Kashmir have increased because of numerous failed policies of the 1970s, 80s and 90s, there's been a tendency to put everything on, to make Simla a kind of scapegoat for those failures, without looking at actually what happened in 1972 at that time.
Now, Professor Mattoo, on the 18th of May 1974, India conducted its first nuclear detonation, described by the Indian government as a peaceful nuclear explosion. What was the international environment that led India to conduct this test?
I think one was clearly a realization that despite the Soviet Union being a friend and having signed a treaty of peace and friendship, the general international system was hostile. The United States had arrived at a modus vivendi with China. United States under Nixon was deeply hostile, as was Kissinger. Secondly, you had the NPT in place, where India, under, I think, Ambassador Trivedi, was the Indian spokesperson who was the ambassador who had described this as an unequal discriminatory treaty. There was a realization that the window of opportunity for doing anything on the nuclear front was closing. Now, India had invested through the Atoms of Peace program, but more generally through its own efforts, in building this huge nuclear facilities spread out across India. And there was pressure from the scientists as well. So there was a scientific bureaucratic momentum. A hostile international system, a discriminatory treaty which was being forced down your throat. India was resisting it. So under those circumstances, India tested a nuclear weapon. Of course, called it a peaceful nuclear explosion, although that for some people that's an oxymoron because how can nuclear explosions be peaceful? But in any case, one of the questions again in hindsight was, having tested, why didn't we weaponize?
Yes.
Why didn't we test again? But apparently, and this is again something which hopefully sources will be declassified one day, that the pressure on the Soviet Union, because there was a certain agreement between the two superpowers, and one of the agreements was that non-proliferation was going to destabilize the international system. So there was pressure not as much from the United States, but from the Soviet Union. So 74 at that stage was again a brilliant achievement, but not having weaponized, you bore the brunt of American sanctions without really converting your explosion into a proper nuclear deterrent.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, another big milestone during this period was the integration of Sikkim when it became India's 22nd state in 1975. What led to this development?
Well, Sikkim had been a somewhat unusual feature in that it had a status unlike that of Nepal and Bhutan, which were sovereign entities, and it was more akin to the princely states which had been integrated into India in 1947. Sikkim, for various reasons, was left out of that process. And through the 60s and 70s, there was growing political instability in Sikkim because of a changed demographic balance, that it had become the majority of the population of Sikkim was Nepali. The ruling house was the indigenous Bhutias, and there was the growing friction because of this basic asymmetry. There was also a sense growing in India from the early 1970s that the Chogyal of Sikkim was also trying to play diplomatic or political or geopolitical games with China, with Pakistan, with the United States. And there was a feeling that if we don't deal with this now, this could remain a problem and become a bigger problem in the future. So these were the factors which led India to act as it did and integrate Sikkim as another state of the Federation.
Now, Suhasini, this was also the time of the LTTE militancy in Sri Lanka and the Indo Sri Lanka Accord, which led to the deployment of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, from 1987 to 1990. Was that a blunder?
Well, you know, it is a huge swathe of history to look at, and even today we're seeing the kind of unrest in Sri Lanka. So you have to think about what was happening at the time. And the Indo-Sri Lankan Peace Accord was actually not the end of the problems. It was the end of the beginning, if you like. Because it had been forced down then President Jayawardene with a very huge Indian show of force. Now, when I speak about realism in this period, you see Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi essentially saying that I am going to have to show force. India can no longer, you know, just sort of be nice to its neighbors and expect that they will do what we say. I think he was probably guided as well by the military at the time, and they launched something called Operation Pumalai, which people don't speak about so much anymore. It actually means a garland of flowers, and that was the formation of the Air Force that went in, now you think about it, into Jaffna. And airdrop 25 tons of supplies. It was seen as a move, almost a recognition of the Tamil movement there. And so it was the accord that followed was seen as a kind of, you know, at gunpoint kind of signed by the Sri Lankan side. Now, part of that accord became India taking the opposite position now. Instead of the support to the Tamil side, we saw the Indian army now becoming part of an in terms of a peacekeeping force, which would mean essentially that they were trying to find some peace between Sri Lankan forces and the LTTE, but eventually they pitted them against the LTTE. And I think General Kalkat wrote about it, that when the chief minister of the Northeast province was sworn in, I sent a message back to say operation, you know, mission accomplished. And then New Delhi said, actually not so fast, because then for 3 years the IPKF went. When you ask if there was a blunder, and I think, you know, there's been a lot written about this.
In the sense that the Sri Lankans were arming the LTTE against the IPKF?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the the idea that we suddenly shifted signs and people didn't understand. But I think within the accord itself, and these are lasting failures, we see the impact of them even today. The failure, for example, to follow through ensuring that the Sri Lankan government kept its word on constitutional guarantees, devolution, that sort of thing. The failure really to see how the Tamil politics played out. And this led to the tragic assassination of former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi as well. The idea that they didn't understand the politics between Tamil Nadu and what was happening in the north of Sri Lanka. And finally, and I think we have made some headway in this, the failure to acknowledge India's own losses. We lost 1,200 soldiers at the time, and we kind of almost tried to walk away from this as a failure and not talk about it anymore. But I think subsequent years we have made up for that.
Now, this was also a period when international terrorism reached our doorstep virtually, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the US decision to arm the Mujahideen. How did that impact India?
Again, lasting impact. I mean, when you think about the idea that in 1979, of course, India did not, like Hungary, did not criticize the Soviet invasion. India was a beneficiary in many ways of a moderate Afghanistan, of a, of being on this side really of that divide. But now we look at a situation 40 years later where India has more or less kind of made its peace with the idea that forces like the Taliban, which have been created in a sense by Pakistan, are ruling Kabul, and India is actually on its way to forging some kind of a relationship over there. I think it does show that we perhaps were caught off guard by what followed. Some of it was because of the Soviet Union's collapse and we didn't see what was going on. But the coming together of the United States and Pakistan wasn't just about the idea of these two countries working together, because they've worked together on so many things. But it was this American idea, which they have now abandoned, but an American idea at the time that if they could somehow mobilize religious forces, jihadist forces or other religious extremist forces, they could defeat communism. In a sense, use godliness against godlessness. But it had such diabolical consequences that the world is still suffering for much of this kind of policy. And India suffered for a very long time. The Kashmir militancy began in the early 90s. We saw the kind of influx of Afghan fighters as well in there. And over the years, India, whether it was the IC-814 hijack, India has paid the price for this coming together of the US and Pakistan.
Now, Professor Mattoo, this period also marked the opening up of our relations with the United States, with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visiting the US twice in 1985 and 1987. What led to the thaw in India-US ties?
I think this is a particularly sophisticated period of Indian diplomacy, where you see that the MEA and the Prime Minister didn't see the world in zero-sum terms, in black and white, and recognized, in fact, a different reading of Afghanistan post-79, that you needed to have more flexibility in your options. If you recall, I think Ambassador Brajesh Mishra had nuanced India's own position on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because it was nothing short of that. We could have, but had clearly nuanced that position. Mrs. Gandhi herself apparently communicated this to Brezhnev, that this is as far as India could go. So that Soviet intervention in some ways created the impulse for more flexibility. Secondly, you also recognize that the United States now had an entente, and which is going to become bigger in terms of the trade and other relations with China. Already the United States was deeply embedded in Pakistan. Under the Pressler Amendment, you were going to allow them access to virtually everything, and we're suffering the consequences even now. So at that stage, Mrs. Gandhi, before even Rajiv Gandhi, made that opening, and she found an interlocutor who was more right-wing than Richard Nixon, but had the imagination, particularly since he had come from Hollywood, Ronald Reagan, to know that these are possibilities, even though he saw the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And yet he reached out to Mrs. Gandhi, and the first signs of that was, of course, the technology memorandum. And of course, in Rajiv Gandhi, you had a modern man with a modern vision who was almost obsessed with technology and high-level technology. And this was also the beginnings of that kind of warmth within the diasporas.
Well, finally, we now turn to the third phase, 1991 to 2014. This period began with the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. It also marked the beginning of our economic liberalization program. So, Suhasini, how would you characterize this phase of our foreign relations?
So I think we're now moving very slowly, but we're seeing a real pragmatism come in. In India, in the early 90s, the prime ministership of P.V. Narasimha Rao, and I think some very, very major decisions were made in India's foreign policy, but they were made out of a compulsion and, as I said, this kind of pragmatism. Why do I say compulsion? Very quickly, four things happened. One was the need for economic reform that really came out of not just the Soviet Union collapse, but the idea that China was moving very quickly ahead after their opening with the United States. I think there was a sudden understanding of the need for energy security, because remember the early 90s also saw the Gulf War. And we saw India reach out in many different ways, not just to the Gulf, but now opening with Israel as well. And I think that that opening in the early 1990s,
1992.
That's right, really showed a kind of pragmatism that was guiding Indian foreign policy. I think there was also post-Soviet a need for military diversification, which could only mean one thing. Which could only mean that you have to find other partners, military partners. And while we haven't diversified that much even today, the process began at that time. And finally, I think there was the pragmatism towards the neighborhood.
What were the imperatives that led us to adopt the Look East policy during that period?
The view to our west, which is Pakistan, which is Iran, Afghanistan, the whole of Central Asia, what was happening in West Asia because of the Gulf War, was generally a dismal view. It seemed to be pulling us back from an era from which we wanted to now graduate. And to our east, in fact, looked a different prospect, because here you had the tiger economies and, of course, the Chinese economy, which was powering these tiger economies' growth even further. So I think in these considerations was born the view that we have to look east and try to forge stronger relations with a region with which we have not had much to do. And the reason we had not had much to do with Southeast Asia till then was also related to the politics of the Cold War. Because we took a different position with regard to what was happening in Cambodia, that left us out of tune with ASEAN, and it required a reconfiguration in Southeast Asia, with Vietnam joining ASEAN to enable us to establish stronger relations with Malaysia, with Singapore.
How important was the opening up to China in 1993 and the border-related confidence-building measures?
Oh, absolutely, because you look at the years that followed and the kind of relative calm we had until some time ago. And you see that, you know, what had happened after 1962 was that ties had frozen completely. We had a skirmish in the late 60s. We'd seen our last deaths perhaps at the LAC in 1975. That was at a different part of the LAC. But we hadn't seen any movement between the two countries. So the thaw that came about didn't just mark a move away from the freeze of the 1960s. It didn't just mark a difference in outlook when it came to China, as you pointed out, because, you know, the whole world was opening up to China in a sense. It also marked the ending of a very long standoff at the LAC, Sundarongchu, that began in 1987, that the Indian Army had been in the standoff with China for. And it had continued until they were actually able to forge these principles of, confidence-building measures at the line of actual control. I think it was also the signal, and we saw that later, for the opening of business and trade, which has been such an important part of Indian foreign policy this point onwards. Suddenly, economic trade, as I said, post-1991, if you remember, there used to be these joint statements that came out, or when the Prime Minister visited, you would see joint statements coming out essentially on political issues. Now, suddenly, you saw the economic issues, the trade negotiations, really taking a new life. More recently, we've seen them take center stage even in bilateral ties. So you do see a shift in Indian foreign policy as well. Of course, it was possible then to discuss other issues between the two. There was an era of working with China, even in the neighborhood. As we see later in the 1990s, there was a point at which China actually suggested that India and China should work to create infrastructure possibilities in Nepal and other parts of the neighborhood. That, of course, is now no longer seems on the horizon. In fact, China has moved into the neighborhood in a way it didn't. In the early 1990s, China actually rejected a Nepali desire for some kind of help when there was a lockdown with India. That has changed completely a few decades later. But at that time, the détente between India and China really had huge repercussions.
Now, Professor Mattoo, as you said, what was started by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was finally completed by Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1998 when India went in for the nuclear tests. How did that impact India?
I think if the creation of Bangladesh was one great marker of both self-confidence as well as really using your diplomacy, your military and your intelligence to the best of your capability, Pokhran II, the Shakti tests, were the other marker. You evaded a US surveillance, which was almost there on a permanent basis. You were able to not sign the CTBT and then demonstrate that you had the capability to make nuclear weapons. And rather than act coy about it, as Mrs. Gandhi had unfortunately done by describing the test as a peaceful nuclear explosion, Prime Minister Vajpayee came out and said that India is now a nuclear weapon state. The initial reaction was hostile, as was not surprising. The Americans sanctioned India comprehensively, but only to recognize immediately thereafter, almost within months, Bill Clinton, that you can't sanction a country like India. And a democratic India with nuclear weapons, or at least the military capacity, was probably essential in the long term to balance China. And soon enough, those sanctions were lifted. An exception was made for India in the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Of course, there were problems. Pakistan thought that under the nuclear deterrent, you could continue having asymmetric operations against India, and Kargil was recognition of that. But even after Kargil and the victory of Kargil, there was the Memorandum of Understanding exchange in Lahore, which talked about a range of confidence-building measures. But I think almost everyone today, irrespective of what they said, irrespective of what they felt in 1988, would recognize that this was the greatest and most important signal that India could give to the world that it had arrived. And unlike in 74, you had the economic revolution through the IIT and through your opening up of your economy, where you could actually take on the costs.
Now, Professor Mattoo mentioned the Kargil War of 1999. What lessons did that bring us?
Well, the most significant lesson which I think many in India drew from the entire Kargil episode was that you cannot look at military moves in isolation from a larger political context, because clearly the mistake which Pakistan made was by thinking that they could act tactically without a political consequence, which brought on them the wrath of world opinion, because they had clearly the way the Kargil operation was timed, it wrecked a major political initiative which had been launched by Prime Ministers Nawaz Sharif and Prime Minister Vajpayee, and the whole world saw it as that. They saw a tactical military operation disrupting a larger initiative for peace in South Asia. So I think the lesson which India drew from Pakistan's isolation, as also from its military failure in Kargil, was that you cannot look at military or security issues in isolation from the larger political environment. And I think that is a very important lesson which we need to continue to internalize regardless of the time which has passed, because having a securitized view of the world does lead to this drawback of thinking that national security is everything. But in fact, national interest consists of much more than national security. There's also the political aspect, there's the economic aspect, all of which Pakistan neglected and which we paid attention to.
Now, Suhasini, you had mentioned the opening up to the neighbors. So how do you evaluate the Gujarat Doctrine in this context?
Right, so we have to go back a few years now to that period between 96 and 98, because of course he was foreign minister 96 to 97 under Prime Minister Deva Gowda, and then he was Prime Minister himself. But the Gujarat Doctrine really encompassed a philosophy which I think some of which is even being followed today. For example, when you speak about friendly neighbors, there will be no reciprocal action. India will help without expecting reciprocity. I think that's true even today. When you talk about non-interference, the non-use of land, of territory against each other, peaceful bilateral negotiations, these were all very important parts of the Gujarat Doctrine. And if you look at just that period, how productive it was, given that politically, domestically, the government was always shaky. It could have fallen at any point in those 2 years. It was a very weak coalition government. But they were able to do the comprehensive bilateral dialogue with Pakistan, the Mahakali Agreement with Nepal. Then we had the Ganga Water Treaty with Bangladesh.
Yes.
There were development cooperation that was inaugurated and the Etka talks with Sri Lanka as well. And then you saw even with Afghanistan, them being able to take a strong principled stand when the Taliban took over, supporting the Northern Alliance, taking in Afghan refugees to India. So this was all a very strong foreign policy, a little out of step with the actual weakness of the government. But we saw it in another very interesting thing that happened at that time was domestically. Kashmir saw an election after years of very fierce militancy, which was seen as, by and large, a kind of heralding of a new peace in Jammu Kashmir. Of course, militancy continued for many years after that, but we saw elections successively. There were 3 elections that went on after that, or 4 elections that went on after that. So it was a new period in Kashmir as well.
Professor Mattoo, how important was the 123 agreement with the United States in 2005 in ending India's nuclear isolation for good?
Absolutely, very, very significant. There's no question. I mean, I think the start of the isolation, ending of the isolation began with the Stope-Talbot-Jaswant Singh talks, but didn't really lead to a breakthrough. I think even till then, the United States was keen that India should sign and ratify the CTBT, even though they hadn't done so themselves. But India, of course, gave a unilateral commitment that they will not test further. But getting access to technology, getting access to especially dual-use technology, as well as becoming part of a regime which, I mean, India had abided by all the principles of the NPT without being party to that discriminatory regime. So having India part of that regime was important for the West, important for the P5 as well, but it was important for India to be a part of that, because then you would get all the benefits of being a nuclear weapon state, even though the NPT may not recognize you. So 123 was a clear signal that the Americans recognized the importance of India. And frankly, in that, President Bush Jr., Bush Dubia, he took a personal interest in ensuring that, because he genuinely believed that a strong, democratic India was important in Asia. In fact, his ambassador used to often talk about how the first question that, before he gave him the position, Blackwell, he said, Bush invited him to his ranch in Texas and said, Robert, just think of this, 1 billion people, 100 million Muslims, and no Al-Qaeda. That this is the power of Indian democracy, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we can isolate it when we're building up a hostile, potentially hostile China.
Now, Ambassador Raghavan, there was also an outreach to Pakistan by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, beginning with the visit of Pervez Musharraf to India in 2005, and continuing off and on despite the 2008 terror attacks in Mumbai. Did it achieve anything?
Well, it's interesting as to what happened in that period, because in the normal course, because India and Pakistan, their differences are so deep and so foundational, even the most incorrigible optimists, talk in terms of how to manage the relationship. How do you see that there is some minimum stability in what is going to always be in a disharmonious relationship? What Prime Minister Manmohan Singh attempted was something different. For the first and only time, he tried to envisage an end game to how does to India-Pakistan relations, and this he did through the back channel, which was part of the larger composite dialogue and discussion process between India and Pakistan as to see what is the kind of future we can aim towards in Jammu and Kashmir between India and Pakistan, and which both countries could live. So it is certainly breathtaking in its ambition, and whether it would have worked or not is a different matter, but it has left behind a template in terms of cross-border, cross-LOC movements, in terms of tourism, pilgrimages. That template is certainly an enduring legacy of that period, even if there have not been any immediate successes to show for it.
Suhasini, final question. What were some of the other major foreign policy initiatives during this period, this last period?
I think you actually saw so much happening, but one of the things I think that stood out was India's economic prowess came to the international stage. And this was because in that 2007-2008, the global financial crisis, somehow it seemed as if India was able to steer its boat above the troubled waters. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was very much in demand, really. We heard, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at that time in 2013, 2014, when he came to India, actually described him as his mentor, because he had seen how India had seen itself through the economic crisis of the time. I think that was one of the big achievements of the time. Of course, the growth of India as a market as a result, but the other important initiatives, the Quad saw its first avatar at the time, a recognition that you will need to somehow guard the global commons in the East Indo-Pacific, began at that time. India's humanitarian assistance during the tsunami was a huge leap for India. You know, we were sending ships to Sri Lanka, to Indonesia, and we were really seen as a credible partner in the Quad as a result of that. The reach out to Japan, I think, was very significant, as well as to Israel. We saw better relationships. Many big conferences were held, the India-Africa Summit at the time as well. And just to add to what Ambassador...
And BRICS was, of
BRICS
course,
was another big achievement that came out of actually, a think tank, an investment funds paper. But it was taken forward when the leaders of the BRICS came together and given an economic structure that is still lasting. An NDB, the National New Development Bank, that is giving so many loans out to people. But I will come back to the period Ambassador Raghavan spoke about to say that even when the peace process ran aground with 26/11, the Mumbai attacks, Pakistan's role in that terror attack, I think India also made a point on the international stage of carrying forward terror investigations and making the point that India would not rest until these people had been brought to justice. And that also guided a lot of the foreign policy objectives in the next few years.
Well, it has been an absolute treat to listen to all three of you as you gave us this tour de horizon of Indian foreign policy from 1947 to 2014. Thank you very much for your brilliant insights. Obviously, in an hour, we could not cover everything, but we tried to give you a very clear-headed and objective analysis of how India's foreign policy evolved over the last 7 decades, moving from idealism to realism to pragmatism. In our next special show, we will cover the foreign policy of the Modi government. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.